"They stole my clothes! Cowboy, please help me!" cried the Apache woman, standing waist-deep in the creek. The sun was sinking low over the north pasture when Jed Calloway reined in his horse. It had been one of those long, punishing days, the kind that left a man's shirt soaked through and his shoulders aching from mending fence under the desert heat. The creek ran slow that time of year, broken into muddy pools beneath the cottonwoods. Still, it was enough for the cattle. And enough for Jed to check before heading home. At 37, Jed had lived half his life on the border between peace and war. Once he'd scouted for the army, seen too much of what men could do when no one was watching. 3 years back, Mary Calloway, his wife, died of spring fever. Since then, the ranch had been his only world, quiet, honest work that kept his hands busy and his thoughts from wandering too far. He was thinking about a sagging fence post along the north line when something moved down by the water. At first he figured it was a deer, but the shape wasn't right. He swung out of the saddle, looped the reins over a low branch, and stepped closer, his boots crunching dry grass. Then he saw her. A young woman stood in the shallows, her dark hair heavy with water clinging to her bare back. Her shoulders were tight like a cornered wild thing. What remained of her dress hung in tatters torn low across her chest. Jed looked away quick, his throat tightening. Her feet were raw from running. Bruises marked her arms, old and fresh. She froze when she spotted him. One arm crossed over her chest, the other pointed toward the riverbank where scraps of fabric lay scattered in the mud. Her voice broke with exhaustion and fear. "They took my clothes, Cowboy. Please help me." Jed didn't speak right away. He measured the scene, who she might be running from, whether someone was close behind, whether taking her home would mean trouble. But the terror in her eyes cut through all of that. Slowly, he shrugged off his coat and held it out. "Easy now," he said, keeping his tone low. She stared at him, eyes searching for a lie, a trap. After a long breath, she snatched the coat, turned her back, and pulled it around her shivering body. "All right," Jed murmured. He offered a hand, steady and patient, guiding her toward the bank. Her skin was cold, despite the heat, her breathing shallow. Up close, he saw scratches on her legs and ribs showing through the torn cloth. When she stumbled, he lifted her easily onto his horse. She clung to the saddle horn while he climbed up, then gripped the back of his shirt as they rode. Neither spoke on the long, dusty trail home. He could feel her trembling behind him, the tremor of someone half-starved and terrified. When they reached the cabin, Jed swung down first and caught her before she fell. Inside, he lit a lantern. The small flame threw warm light across the rough pine walls, table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, a stove stacked with firewood. He'd kept it that way since Mary died, simple, almost bare easier, not to make it feel like a home. "You can sit here," he said, setting a folded blanket near the hearth. She obeyed, wrapping herself tighter in his coat, eyes darting toward every corner as though she expected the door to burst open. Jed didn't question her yet. He built up the fire, set a pot of water to boil, then pulled a small sewing kit from a tin box. The woman's dress was nearly shredded, but he stitched it together anyway, rough but careful. She watched him work, studying the way his hands moved, deciding whether he could be trusted. By the time he tied off the last thread, the cabin was warm, and her shaking had eased. She still looked wary, though, like a doe that hadn't yet decided if the hunter meant harm. Jed set the mended dress aside and leaned against the wall. He didn't know her name, didn't know what hell had driven her to the creek, or who had done this to her. But she was alive, and for now, safe, and that would have to be enough. That night, Jed didn't sleep. He sat at the table rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the door, listening to the night wind. The fire burned low shadows crawling across the walls. Behind him, the woman lay near the hearth, wrapped in his coat, and a blanket, her breathing uneven, like she still half expected footsteps outside. It wasn't the first time Jed had brought someone hurt or half-starved into this cabin. During the war, it had been soldiers, scouts, even deserters, anyone he couldn't leave to die in the dust. But this felt different. Jed didn't know her name or what kind of storm might be chasing her, and that unease kept him from shutting his eyes all night. When the first pale light slipped through the cracks in the shutters, he stirred the coals back to life. The sharp smell of smoke woke her. She pushed herself up slowly, clutching his coat tighter around her shoulders, hair falling loose across her face. Jed set the tin coffee pot on the stove, waiting until the water began to roll. "There's a wash basin outside," he said quietly. "Nobody around this early." She hesitated, then gave a small nod. When she stood, the coat fell open just enough for Jed to catch sight of red marks on her shoulder. Rope burns, maybe. She pulled the fabric close again before stepping out. He followed her outside, but kept his distance, chopping kindling by the porch so she wouldn't feel his eyes on her. Her hands trembled as she splashed cold water over her face. More from nerves than chill. Back inside, she settled near the fire again, her hair wet and glistening down her back. Jed poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed one to her. She stared at it for a long moment before taking a sip. "You got a name?" he asked. Through the curtain of her hair, she murmured, "Taya. Taya Nez." Jed nodded once. "I'm Jed Calloway." He gave her a bit of quiet before asking, "You want to tell me what happened?" Her hands tightened around the cup. When she spoke, her tone was flat, stripped of emotion. 3 white boys. I crossed near the town yesterday. They stopped me, laughed, took my things. Jed's jaw tightened. "Just your clothes?" "And my food," she said. "I had corn in a sack. They threw it in the dirt." Her words came clipped shame flickering across her face as she stared into the fire. Jed knew the kind young drifters who lingered around the saloon, drunk on whiskey and power, looking for something easy to break. He could picture them spotting her on the road, tired, alone, and brown-skinned. Easy prey. "You got any family close by?" he asked. "No," she said, her voice steady, now harder. "I came north to find work. Maybe trade. There's nothing left down south." That told him plenty. He'd heard what had happened to the Apache camps after the Army's last sweep burned out families scattered. She was lucky to be breathing. Jed leaned back, thinking. He had no reason to keep her here, and taking her toward town might stir trouble he didn't need. But sending her off with nothing would be a death sentence. "You can stay here a while," he said finally. "Till you figure where you're headed." Her dark eyes flicked up, sharp and cautious. "Why?" "Because I've got room," he said simply, "and I don't let folks starve on my doorstep." Taya didn't answer. She just set the empty tin cup aside and pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. After breakfast, Jed brought out the mended dress. The stitches were rough, but it would hold. He turned his back while she changed near the corner of the cabin, keeping his eyes fixed on the fire, until she said quietly, "Okay." When she stepped out, the dress fit her again tight across the chest, where his hand had pulled the thread too close. Jed caught himself looking, then turned away fast. "Got work to do," he said, grabbing his hat from the peg. "You can rest, or come along." "I'll come," she said quickly, as though the thought of being left alone was worse. Jed saddled the horse, and they headed out together. Taya kept close behind him, saying little, watching how he checked each fence post and tightened wire. She moved slow at first, limping from the cuts on her feet, but before long she started carrying tools for him without being asked. By noon the sun was high, and they stopped by the creek so the horse could drink. Taya knelt to wash the mud from her legs, careful to keep her back turned. Not from modesty, Jed realized, but from fear of what she couldn't see behind her. "You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder here," he said quietly. Without turning, she replied, "I keep watch for myself." When they got back to the cabin, Jed sat her on the porch rail with a needle and a strip of cloth. "You know how to sew?" She nodded once. He left her there while he stacked wood. By the time the sun began to dip, she'd already finished the patch and was threading the needle again, steady hands, working in the fading light. That night, Jed Calloway sat out on the porch, rifle resting across his knees, eyes scanning the dark line of trees beyond the corral. Inside, Taya Nez lay close to the fire, her breathing easier, now steady against the crackle of the flames. Still, Jed knew peace like this never lasted long out here. Whoever those boys were, they might come hunting again, and if they did, he'd be ready. For now, the night held only the sound of crickets and the soft pop of burning wood. It was the first time since finding her that Jed felt something other than anger or suspicion. Maybe, just maybe, she'd decided not to run. At dawn, when the horizon turned gray, Jed pushed open the cabin door and stepped outside. The air was cool, sharp, with the scent of sage. Behind him, he heard Taya stir, pulling his coat tight around her shoulders as she rose from her blanket. Jed poured water into the pot and set it to boil, then handed her a plate with the last of last night's cornbread. She ate slowly, eyes flicking toward the door, as though expecting trouble to come walking through it. "You can stay in today if you'd rather rest," Jed said, pouring her coffee. Taya shook her head. "I work," she said firmly, her voice low but certain. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Her feet were still raw, but he understood. Keeping busy was better than sitting still with ghosts. He rummaged through a trunk and pulled out an old pair of wool socks. "These'll make it easier on your feet," he said. She took them without complaint, tugged them on, and waited by the door like a ranch hand waiting on orders. They spent the morning hauling buckets from the creek to fill the trough. Taya worked without a word, steady but stiff, the muscles in her arms trembling with effort. "You can rest a bit," Jed told her once. She just shook her head and kept walking. By midday, the trough was full. Jed led his horse to drink while Taya stood by the gate, tense as a bowstring when the animal snorted and tossed its head. "You ever worked around stock before?" he asked. She shook her head. "Goats, chickens, not horses. You'll get used to him," Jed said, his tone calm and even. "He won't hurt you." She gave a small nod, though she didn't move closer until he'd finished brushing the horse down. After a quiet meal back at the cabin, Jed stepped out to the shed for tools. When he returned, Taya was sweeping the porch with a bundle of sticks tied together for a broom. Her dark hair had slipped loose around her face, catching the sunlight. "You don't have to do that," Jed said. "I do," she answered simply and kept sweeping. Jed didn't argue. He understood this wasn't about cleaning. It was about taking back some small piece of control. Later that afternoon, they walked the fence line again. As they worked, Jed's eyes kept drifting toward the far ridge and the road to town. He hadn't seen anyone nearby since the night she came, but the thought of those boys still itched at the back of his mind. "You know their names?" he asked at last. Taya hesitated. "One called Buck," she said softly. "The others, I don't know." Jed nodded slowly. Buck Harlan. The name rang familiar, a ranch hand's boy mean, when drunk, always itching for trouble. "If they show up here," Jed said, "you stay inside." Her dark eyes met his. "You'll fight them if I have to," he replied. His voice was steady, but the edge beneath it was sharp as steel. They finished mending the fence just before sundown and headed back to the cabin. When Jed struck a match and lit the lamp, he noticed Taya watching him, as though weighing whether to speak. "You'll take me to town?" she asked quietly. Jed looked at her for a long moment. "Not yet," he said. "Not till I know it's safe." She didn't argue, but her shoulders eased, as if she'd been afraid he might send her away. That night, Jed cooked beans and salt pork, while Taya sat at the table mending one of his torn work shirts. Her hands moved sure and quick, practiced. When she finished, she folded the shirt neatly and set it in front of him. "You sew better than I do," Jed said with a faint grin. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "My mother taught me." When the fire burned low, Jed unrolled his bedroll on the floor instead of taking the cot. Taya looked up, surprised. "You sleep there?" she asked. "Cot's yours tonight," Jed said simply. She lingered for a moment before lying down on the cot, still wrapped snug in Jed's old coat. It was the first time she'd slept anywhere but the floor since she arrived. Jed Calloway stayed up longer than he meant to, listening to the sounds that filled the prairie night, the whisper of wind, the steady chirp of crickets, the low crackle of dying firewood, and finally the even rhythm of Taya Nez's breathing. The habit of vigilance came back to him easy, the same one that had kept him alive years ago while scouting for the army. Only now it wasn't his own skin he was guarding. It was hers. Before sleep finally took him, he made up his mind. Tomorrow he'd ride into town. Quiet, careful. He needed to see who was hanging around and whether any talk had started about her. If trouble was coming, he'd rather meet it halfway than let it find his door first. For now, the cabin held its stillness. The fear that had shadowed her face was easing bit by bit. And though he'd never say it out loud, that was reason enough to let her stay one more day. Jed was up before sunrise. The air outside bit cold enough that his breath showed white in the dawn light. He saddled his horse in silence, checked the cinch twice, then stepped back inside. Taya was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, his coat still wrapped tight around her shoulders. "You're riding out?" she asked. "Just into town," he said, pulling on his hat. "Need to see who's been hanging around." Her jaw tightened. "Buck Harlan." "Maybe," Jed said. "Better I find out than wait for him to come here." She rose like she meant to go with him, but Jed shook his head. "Safer if you stay put. Keep the door barred. Rifles behind the table if you need it." She hesitated, then nodded once her face pale, but steady. The ride into town was quiet, the sky stretching wide and gold as the sun climbed the ridges. Every rustle in the grass made Jed check the horizon out of habit. By the time he reached Main Street, the town was just waking wagons rattling over the dirt, a boy sweeping outside the general store, the first hiss of a forge somewhere down the alley. He tied his horse near the feedlot and headed for the saloon. The place reeked of stale whiskey and last night's smoke. Inside, the barkeep looked surprised to see him so early. Jed ordered coffee and took a table near the back, where he could watch the door. It didn't take long before he spotted them, two young men, loud and cocky, laughing too hard at nothing. One had his hat pushed back and hair too long under it. Buck Harlan. Jed remembered that face from roundups a few years back. The same smirk, the same mean glint in the eye. They didn't notice him at first, but when they did, the laughter died. Buck straightened his tone, carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "Well, look who rode in. Heard you've been keeping yourself a little pet up at your place, Calloway." Jed didn't move. Didn't blink. "You got something to say it." Buck grinned, leaning back in his chair. "She's a wild one, ain't she? You should have seen her run. We were just having a little fun." Jed stood slowly, setting his tin cup down with a dull thud. The saloon went dead quiet, except for the creak of boots on floorboards. "You come near my land again," Jed said, voice flat as cold iron. "You won't walk away." Buck's grin faltered, but didn't die. "You think you can keep her?" Jed's hand hovered near his gun, though he didn't draw. "I think you'd best finish your drink and ride the other way." The bartender cleared his throat nervously. "Boys, take it outside or take it nowhere." Buck stared for a beat, then spat near the stove. "Let's go," he muttered to his friend, and the two of them pushed out through the bat-wing doors, the sound of their boots fading into the street. Jed waited a long minute before following, making sure they were headed out of town. He didn't like leaving them angry, but at least now he had faces to go with the threat. He'd be ready next time. By the time he rode back, the sun was high overhead. Smoke from the cabin chimney was already rising in a lazy curl. Taya was outside, crouched near a patch of soil, turning the earth with a stick. She jumped up the moment she saw him ride in. "You saw them?" she asked. "I saw them," Jed said, sliding off the saddle. Her dark eyes searched his face. "They'll come here. Not yet," he answered. "Might try, but they know I'm watching." Her shoulders eased a little, though her grip on the stick stayed tight, like she wasn't ready to trust quiet yet. "Come inside," Jed said. "I brought flour. We'll make bread." It was a small thing, but she followed him in setting the stick by the door before washing her hands. They worked side by side at the table, kneading dough together. Her hands were small and scarred, yet sure. For the first time since he'd found her, a trace of calm softened her face. After sliding the bread into the stove, Jed Calloway showed Taya Nez how to load the rifle properly. She paid close attention, brow furrowed, steady as a stone, while she mimicked his movements. When she cocked the lever and shouldered the weapon without trembling, Jed gave a small nod. "That's good," he said quietly. "Only if I need to use it," she replied. "You got that right?" That night they ate warm bread and beans by the fire. Taya sat close enough that her knee nearly brushed Jed's. She didn't talk much, but when he stood to check the latch on the door, she followed his every move, with her eyes trusting him to keep the dark outside where it belonged. When Jed rolled out his bed on the floor, she lingered near the fire for a while, watching the flames dance. Then she rose quietly, crossed the room, and spread her blanket a few feet closer to him. Jed looked over, but said nothing. She didn't explain herself, and he didn't ask. The fire snapped softly. Wind whispered through the cracks of the cabin walls. For the first time, the quiet between them didn't feel like fear. It felt like belonging. Jed lay back, staring at the low ceiling beams, one hand resting near the rifle, the other close enough that if she reached out, her fingers would find his. Just after sundown the next evening, the wind shifted. It carried the faint, bitter scent of wood smoke too close to be from town. Jed caught it first, standing out on the porch with a lantern in one hand, eyes fixed on the ridge. The horses stirred uneasily in the corral, ears twitching toward the north trail. Inside, Taya was wiping down the table, her dark hair tied back with a strip of cloth. When Jed stepped back through the door, she froze at the look on his face. "What is it?" she asked. "Smoke," he said low. "Someone's camped up by the north trail." Her face tensed. She glanced toward the rifle leaning by the door. "Could be drovers," Jed muttered, though his gut told him otherwise. He checked the chamber on his rifle, then jerked his chin toward the lamp. "Blow that out." She did without question, plunging the cabin into near darkness, save for the dim orange glow of the fire. Jed eased back outside, crouched low near the porch rail, and let his eyes adjust. The night stretched long and cold before he saw them, two figures moving low along the fence line, too cautious to be strangers just passing through. He slipped back inside, closing the door soundlessly. "Two of them," he whispered. Taya stood near the hearth, pale, but composed. "Buck?" she asked. "Don't know yet," Jed said, setting the bar across the door. "But they're watching." He motioned her closer. "If they try for the horses, we wait till they're near the corral. Then I step out." "You'll fight?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "If I have to," Jed said. "You stay behind the door, rifles ready if they come for the house." She swallowed hard, nodded, and crouched near the wall. The next hour dragged by heavy, with small sounds, a horse snorting, boots scuffing dirt, low whispers carried by wind. Once Jed caught a faint laugh and knew exactly who it belonged to. When a shadow crept near the corral gate, Jed moved. He unbarred the door and stepped out fast, rifle leveled. "Leave that gate be," he said, his voice cold and steady. The figures froze. In the pale moonlight, Jed recognized Buck Harlan, hat pulled low, smirk still carved on his face. "Evenin' Calloway." Buck said, tone slick as oil. "Didn't mean no harm, just passing through." "You're a long way from the saloon," Jed said. "Turn around and keep walking." Buck didn't budge. "Heard you got company up here. Thought we'd see for ourselves." Jed's finger hovered near the trigger. "You've seen enough. Now go." One of the others, Luke Crow, shifted nervously, glancing toward the trees. "Come on, Buck," he muttered. "Ain't worth it." Buck sneered spit into the dirt and stepped back. "You can't keep her forever," he said. "Watch me," Jed replied, his voice like the click of a hammer being drawn back. After a long glare, Buck turned and vanished into the trees with Luke at his heels. Jed stayed there, eyes fixed on the dark, until the night swallowed their footsteps. When he finally went back inside, Taya was still crouched near the door, the rifle tight in her hands. Her breathing was fast, but her gaze steady. "They gone?" she whispered. "For now," Jed said, setting the bar back in place. She rose slowly, leaned the rifle against the wall, and crossed her arms. "They'll come back," she said quietly. Maybe Jed admitted. "But they know now I'll be waitin'." Taya Nez moved closer to the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames like she was trying to see something beyond them. "You could send me away," she said quietly. "Then there'd be no trouble." Jed Calloway leaned against the doorframe, shaking his head. "Not gonna happen. Trouble ain't you, Taya. It's them, and running only makes it worse." She studied him for a long moment, something in her face softening, shifting. She didn't say thank you, that wasn't her way, but she reached for the same worn coat he'd given her that first night by the creek and wrapped it tight around her shoulders. The fear in her eyes hadn't vanished, but now there was something steadier beneath it. Trust. Maybe even a spark of belonging. Neither of them slept much that night. Jed sat near the door, rifle across his knees, while Taya stayed by the fire until it burned down to embers. When she finally lay on the cot, she didn't curl into herself as tightly as before. At dawn, Jed stepped outside to check the corral. The horses were fine, but fresh boot tracks marked the damp earth closer than he liked. He scuffed them out with his heel before Taya came out to see. They worked together that morning, hauling water and feeding the stock. Taya didn't speak until they sat to eat. "You're not afraid?" she asked suddenly. Jed looked up from his tin cup. "Afraid of what? Of them." He took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "I've seen worse. Learned a long time ago fear don't stop trouble. It just keeps you awake. You can't let it run you." Taya nodded her fingers, tracing the rim of her cup. I tried, she murmured. You did fine last night, Jed said. That earned him the faintest smile, small but real. By evening, the cabin felt changed. Less like a hideout, more like something solid they both shared. Jed sat sharpening his knife, while Taya mended one of his shirts, the quiet between them comfortable now. And when the wind shifted outside, both of them looked toward the door at the same time, ready. Whatever came next, they wouldn't be facing it as strangers anymore. The day after those men had come, the air itself felt heavier, like the land was holding its breath. Jed felt it the moment he stepped outside at dawn. The sky hung low and gray, no wind stirring the cottonwoods. Even the horse seemed uneasy, flicking its ears toward the ridge. Inside, Taya was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire with his coat wrapped tight. She didn't look frightened anymore, just alert, watching him move as if to make sure he was still there. Jed brought in a bucket of water from the well and set it to boil. We'll stay close today, he said. No reason to ride far. Just keep watch. I'll watch too, she said, standing at the door, her eyes sweeping the yard like a scout on guard. They worked in silence through the morning. She gathered kindling, ground fresh flour for bread, and swept the porch until every board gleamed clean. Jed stayed near the corral, fixing a loose rail and keeping his ear tuned to the rustle of trees. By midday, dark clouds rolled over the ridge. Jed nodded toward the sky. Storm's coming. Let's bring the tools in. Taya helped him carry everything to the shed, her hands dirt-streaked but steady. You're not scared? She asked quietly. Scared enough, he said. Just don't let it make me stupid. She was quiet for a beat, then said softly, When you stood out there with your rifle, you didn't shake. Jed leaned against the doorframe, gave a small laugh. I shook plenty on the inside. That made her look at him differently, softer, almost relieved to learn he wasn't made of stone. The rain started at dusk, soft at first, then steady. They stayed inside the sound of it, filling the cabin. Taya sat on the cot, combing her long, dark hair with her fingers. Jed worked his knife at the table, carving a new handle for the shovel. After a long silence, Taya said, You fought for me. Jed didn't look up. Didn't want you seeing those men take another thing from you. She didn't answer right away, but when he finally glanced over, her eyes shone in the firelight. You could have sent me away, she said quietly. I told you before, Jed replied. I don't leave folks to fend for themselves. Taya rose, crossing the room, until she stood right in front of him, close enough that he could smell the faint smoke in her hair. You still look away, she said softly. Jed set the knife down and met her gaze. Just trying to do right by you. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached down, took his rough hand in hers, and placed it against her shoulder where the rope burn had been. The skin was healing, but the mark still told the story. Jed Calloway's breath came slow and steady. You sure? He asked quietly. Taya Nez gave a single nod, her dark eyes never leaving his. He didn't rush. Still holding her hand, Jed rose, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. When his fingers grazed her cheek, she didn't pull back. You're safe here, he murmured. I know, she whispered. When he kissed her, it wasn't fierce or hungry, just gentle, cautious, as if testing whether the world would allow it. Taya leaned into him, her hand clutching the front of his shirt like she was anchoring herself to something solid for the first time in a long while. When they finally broke apart, she didn't step away. Her forehead rested against his chest, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, holding her there in a silence that said more than words could. They spoke little after that, Supper passed quietly, and when the fire burned low, Jed didn't bother unrolling his bed on the floor. He just sat on the edge of the cot, watching her, waiting. Taya didn't refuse him. She only shifted to one side, leaving space for him to lie beside her. They lay still at first, not touching, listening to the rain's soft rhythm on the roof. Then slowly Taya edged closer until her head found the crook of his shoulder. Jed let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and rested his hand lightly over hers. The wind outside carried the scent of rain and wet sage through the cracks in the shutters. For the first time since he'd found her at the creek, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like a home. When sleep came, it came easy. And when Jed stirred sometime in the night, reaching for his rifle, by old habit he felt Taya's hand resting against his chest and allowed himself to relax. The morning after the storm broke clear and cold. The air was sharp, clean, and full of that quiet stillness that only came after rain. Jed woke to find Taya still beside him, her hair spilling across his shoulder. He lay there for a long moment, listening to her even breathing. When her eyes opened, there was no fear in them, only calm recognition that made something tighten in his chest. "You sleep?" he asked softly. Taya nodded. First time she said. Jed smiled faintly, pulled on his boots, and went to stir the fire back to life. The cabin smelled of damp wood and smoke, but it felt different now, lived in settled warmth. After breakfast, Jed saddled his horse. "I'm riding into town," he said. Taya's face changed the calm she'd carried through the morning, slipping just a little. "You stay here?" she asked. "You can come," Jed said, watching her. "Your choice. But if you do, you stay close." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'll come." The trail was soft and muddy from the night's rain, so they rode slow, the horse picking its way along the ruts. Taya's hands gripped the back of Jed's coat, not in fear, but steady as if she was bracing herself for whatever came next. When they reached town, the day was just waking. Folks swept porches, hauled water, and traded quiet talk. Conversations dimmed when eyes fell on Taya, riding behind Jed. He didn't meet their stares. He tied the horse outside the general store and helped her down. She kept her chin, high shoulders squared, though he could see the tight line of her jaw. Inside, the storekeeper looked up, eyebrows rising a touch when he saw them. Jed gave a curt nod. "Need flour, sugar, coffee, and nails." The man packed the order without a word, though his gaze slid toward Taya more than once. She stayed close, hands clasped before her, but when another customer entered, a young man about Buck Harlan's age, her whole body went rigid. Jed noticed. He stepped forward just enough to block her from view, voice calm, but edged. "You got a problem. Take it somewhere else." The man raised both hands. "No trouble, Calloway. Just shopping." Jed didn't move until the man turned away. When they stepped back outside, Taya exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath the whole time. "You didn't look away," she said softly, as Jed tied the parcels to the saddle. "Wouldn't have mattered if I did," he replied. "Folks see what they want to see." "Let them," she said quietly. They made one more stop at the blacksmith before heading out. Near the forge, Jed caught the low voices of two men talking. Word was that Buck Harlan had been thrown out of the saloon the night before, drunk and loud shouting about the woman up at Calloway's place. Jed didn't mention it until they were halfway home. "Word's spreading," he said finally. Taya was silent a long moment. Then she said simply, "Then they'll come." "Maybe," Jed Calloway said quietly, "but I'll be ready." When they got back to the cabin, Taya Nez helped him unload the supplies, her movements quicker, more deliberate than before. She swept out the floorboards, started a pot of beans on the stove, then took the wash down to the creek. Jed watched from the porch for a while, before joining her kneeling beside her as she scrubbed a shirt against the river rock. "You're not planning on running?" he asked. Taya looked up, water dripping from her hands, her eyes steady. "I ran before," she said. "No more." That night they sat side by side on the porch as the sun bled orange across the horizon. Jed had his rifle laid across his lap the same way he always did come sundown. Taya sat close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. "They stare in town," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Let 'em stare," Jed answered. "Doesn't change a damn thing." She was silent for a long while, then asked, "You told them I stay here?" "I just did," he said simply. Taya turned her face toward him. There was something like relief in her eyes. Not a smile exactly, but the kind of look that said she finally believed she belonged. Her hand found his where it rested on his knee. Jed's rough fingers closed gently around hers. When they went inside, Taya walked to the cot without waiting for him to say a word. Jed sat beside her, and this time it was she who reached for him first, pulling him close. Later, when the fire burned low, they lay side by side again, but now there was no space between them. Jed's arm rested across her waist, and Taya's breathing came slow and even, no trace of fear left in it. Outside the crickets sang, and a lone coyote howled somewhere on the ridge, but inside the cabin felt calm, solid, alive. Whatever waited down the trail, they'd face it together. The next 2 days passed under a tense stillness. Jed kept near the cabin, mending fence posts and keeping the rifle close. Taya worked beside him, hanging laundry, cooking, patching the garden rows, but her eyes still flicked to the tree line now and then. She hadn't forgotten the night Buck Harlan came calling. It was near sundown on the 3rd day when the calm shattered. Jed was stacking wood by the shed when he heard it hoofbeats. Not 1 horse. 3. They were coming fast. The sound carried sharp and clear through the evening air. "Taya," he called, voice low but urgent. She was already on the porch, rifle in hand. Jed took it from her, checked the chamber, and handed it back. "Stay inside," he said. "I'll stay by the door," she replied, jaw set. Jed didn't argue. He stepped off the porch and stood near the corral rifle, loose in his hands, but ready to lift. 3 riders came into view. Buck Harlan, Luke Crow, and Denny Pike, dust curling behind them. They slowed near the cabin, stopping far enough away that Jed had to raise his voice. "You're trespassing," he called out. Buck grinned from the saddle. "Easy, Calloway. We just came to talk." "Then talk from the road." Buck swung off his horse boots, crunching in the dirt. "You got no right keeping her up here like she's yours," he said. Jed's jaw tightened. "She's not yours either." Luke spat in the dirt. "She don't belong here." "You know it. She stays where she chooses," Jed said flatly. Buck's grin turned mean. "Does she? Or is she too scared to run?" Jed heard the creak of floorboards behind him. Taya had stepped just inside the doorway. Her voice rang out, steady and clear. "I stay here," she said. Buck's grin faltered. "Girl, you don't know what you're saying." "I know," she shot back. "You took my clothes. You laughed. I won't run again." The air went still heavy enough to choke on. Buck's face hardened as he took another step forward. "That's enough," Jed said, lifting the rifle and sighting down the barrel. "Mount up," he warned. Buck stared him down, weighing whether to push it. The other 2 were already backing their horses. Finally, Buck sneered. "This ain't over, Calloway." "It is if you keep riding," Jed said coldly. Buck spat into the dirt. Then he swung into the saddle and turned his horse toward the trail. The three rode off slow at first, then faster once they cleared the fence line. Jed stood still, rifle steady, until the sound of hooves vanished into the hills. Then he lowered it and turned back to the cabin. Taya was still by the door, her hands gripping the rifle tight. "You all right?" Jed asked. She nodded, though her chest rose and fell fast. "They won't stop," she said. "No," Jed agreed, stepping closer. "But they know now. They know you got a place here." Taya's grip loosened, and for the first time her hands didn't shake. She set the rifle back against the wall, then stepped down off the porch and came toward him. Her hands were rough and dusty from gripping the doorframe, but she placed one flat against his chest. "You stand for me, Taya," Nez said quietly. Jed Calloway nodded once. "Every time." Her fingers tightened in the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, and this time Jed didn't hesitate. He leaned down and kissed her, not tentative or unsure like before, but with certainty. Taya didn't flinch. She pressed into him, her hands gripping the back of his shirt, as though anchoring herself to the moment. When they finally stepped apart, the tension that had lived in her shoulders for days was gone. That night inside the cabin, they sat close by the fire. Jed cleaned his rifle in silence, setting it within easy reach before glancing her way. "If they come back," he said, "we might have to ride into town. Talk to the sheriff. Make it official." Taya tilted her head, her dark eyes searching his face. "Official. It means no one lays a hand on you again without paying for it," he said simply. She thought about that a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Then we go." Later, when they lay down on the cot, Taya didn't wait for him to reach for her. She pressed herself against his chest, her head beneath his chin, and let out a long, slow breath that trembled halfway through. Jed rested his hand against the small of her back. For the first time since the night he'd found her at the creek, he allowed himself to think past the next sunrise, past mending fences, past watching the horizon for trouble. He pictured something steadier, a life where she stayed, because she chose to, not because she had nowhere else to go. Outside, the night stretched quiet. Not the brittle silence of fear, but the strong kind that follows a line drawn and held. The next morning, Jed saddled his horse before the sun was fully up. The air was crisp, the sky pale with the promise of dawn. The sound of boots on the porch brought Taya out. "You're going?" she asked, her voice calm but watchful. "Into town," he said. "Best we end this before it starts again." "You comin'?" She hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. "I come." They rode in together, slow and steady, not hiding this time. When they reached town, heads turned just like before, but Jed didn't so much as glance their way. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and helped Taya down, keeping a protective hand at the small of her back as they stepped inside. Sheriff Amos Burke, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, looked up from his desk. "Calloway," he said, then gave Taya a brief look. "Heard some talk." "You heard right," Jed said flatly. "3 boys, Buck Harlan, Luke Crow, and Denny Pike. Came out to my place at night, tried spooking my stock, threatened her." The sheriff leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Buck's been trouble before. I'll ride out, have a word with his old man, Eli Harlan. Make sure it don't happen again. Talking ain't enough." Jed set his tone hard as a fence post in frost. "If they step foot on my land again, it won't be words next time." Burke studied him for a beat, then nodded slowly. "I'll make it clear." His gaze shifted to Taya. "You want to press charges, miss?" Taya straightened her shoulders. "I want them to stay away," she said. "The men who took my clothes, my food, my name." The sheriff nodded again, slower this time. "Reckon we can make that happen." I'll put it in writing." By the time they stepped back outside, Jed could feel the tension easing from her shoulders. She stopped for a moment, looking down the street. The same men who had whispered about her before were still there watching. But this time, Taya didn't look away. On the ride home, she was quiet, but not the wary, frightened quiet Jed had first known. It was the kind that comes when a person finally decides they're done being hunted. When they reached the cabin, Taya Nez slid down from the saddle and turned to face him. "You make it safe," she said simply. Jed Calloway untied the parcels from the saddle and set them down on the porch. "Safe's not just on me," he said. "But yeah, it's safe now." That evening, Taya cooked stew, while Jed repaired a broken strap on the saddle. The smell of smoke and simmering meat filled the cabin, the kind of smell that made a man remember what home used to feel like. When they finally sat to eat, the room felt warmer than it ever had, not just from the fire, but from the quiet understanding between them. After supper, Taya pulled out the carved comb Jed had bought for her weeks before. She ran it carefully through her hair, braiding it slow and neat. When she was done, she turned toward him. "You gave me this," she said softly, touching the comb. "You fixed my dress. You fought for me." Jed set the strap aside and met her gaze. "Because I want you here," he said. "Not because you need a place, but because you choose it." For a heartbeat, she said nothing, then gave a small, sure nod. "I choose," she whispered. She crossed the room, knelt before him, and took his rough hand in hers. "I stay." Jed's throat tightened. He nodded once. "Then we make this home for good." Later, when the fire had burned low and the night was still, they sat side by side on the porch. The stars stretched wide and sharp across the sky, the air cool and clean. Jed's arm rested around her shoulders, and Taya leaned into him, her eyes half closed. "They won't come back," she murmured. "No," Jed said quietly. "And if they do, they'll find we're ready." For a long while, they just sat there listening to the steady quiet, the wind in the cottonwoods, the faint call of a night bird, the hum of a world settling into peace. Jed's mind drifted back to that first night by the creek, the fear in her eyes, the bruises, the way she'd flinched at every sound. All of that felt distant now. Not gone, but changed, turned into something she'd outlived. When they finally went inside, Jed didn't bother rolling out his bedding on the floor. He lay beside her on the cot, the firelight throwing soft amber across the walls. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter against the world. It felt like a home made for two. The next morning, Jed went out to check the fence. The air was crisp, the sun barely clearing the ridge. When he turned back, Taya was standing on the porch. Her hair was neatly braided, her dress, once torn and dirty, fit clean and proud. In her hands was a small bundle of seed from their last trip into town, ready for planting. Jed smiled, the kind of real quiet smile he hadn't felt in years. "Let's get to work," he said. They worked side by side that morning, hands deep in the soil, the sunlight warming their backs. There was no rush, no fear, just the simple rhythm of planting something meant to last. When Jed looked up and saw her standing there, dirt on her hands, the ghost of a smile playing across her face, he knew without a doubt she wasn't just passing through. She was part of the land now, part of him. And this time he wasn't letting go.